12 wolves. I counted exactly 12 pairs of eyes, reflecting the campfire in yellow-orange points, arranged in a closed circle around our tents. There were 4 of us, 1 hunting knife, and a fire growing weaker because no one dared leave the circle to bring back more wood. The wolves did not attack, they only stood there and waited, tightening the ring inch by inch whenever the flames dropped. Then the ground trembled. Something taller than the trees behind the tents stepped out of the darkness, stood upright between us and the pack, and released a roar that made every wolf take 1 step back at the same time. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, and welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. As always, this account has been gathered and researched by our editorial team from several different sources. We cannot say with absolute certainty whether it is fact or legend, and I invite you to hear it with an open mind. If you believe what is about to happen, leave the comment Sasquatch below. Now, let's return to that circle of fire. Derek Sutton had worked as a professional mountain guide for 10 years, long enough to understand that a safe trip rarely begins with dramatic moments. He was 36, certified in wilderness first aid, licensed to guide groups through high mountain terrain, and almost rigid about one habit: checking everything twice before leaving the trailhead. To Derek, experience was not measured by the number of summits a person had crossed. It was the ability to recognize what might become a problem before it actually did. That late September trek brought Derek and 3 clients into Titcomb Basin, one of the most beautiful glacial lake regions in Wyoming's Wind River Range. The area was known for long, narrow lakes resting between silver-gray mountain slopes and steep walls of rock. But as September came to an end, nighttime temperatures dropped quickly. The wind shifted without warning, and the number of people on the trails fell sharply. Titcomb Basin returned to its natural isolation, a place where a group could walk for hours without seeing anyone. Derek's group included 29-year-old Priya Anand and her 2 close friends, Marcus Bell and Julia Hale. All 3 lived in Colorado and had experience with multi-day camping trips, but none of them had gone deep into the Wind River Range that late in the season. Priya worked in product design for a technology company and had a habit of taking detailed notes during every trip. Julia was a nurse, careful and quieter than the other 2, but always the first to notice when someone needed a break. They met Derek at the trailhead early on the first morning. He checked their boots, thermal layers, sleeping bags, water filters, and satellite communication devices. When he discovered that Marcus had brought only 1 thin pair of gloves, Derek handed him a spare pair from the vehicle. He also required the group to divide their food and medication between different backpacks so nothing essential would be stored in only 1 bag. Marcus laughed at that, but Derek saw it as the normal reaction of someone who had never lost a supply bag in the mountains more than 12 trail miles from the nearest ranger station. Most of the route was not highly technical, but the long distance, elevation above 10,000 feet, and late-season weather made every mistake expensive. Derek had guided groups through the area many times. He knew where to collect water, which sections became slick, and which open spaces were safe enough for tents. He also knew the area held a high wolf population and sat within the range of at least 2 large packs that Wyoming wildlife officials had monitored for years with tracking collars. Derek did not use that information to frighten his clients. Gray wolves normally avoided people, and most hikers knew they were nearby only through tracks, scat, or howls carrying from far away. Still, he explained the basic rules before they left the parking area. Food had to be stored separately and never kept inside a tent. Scented items, including toothpaste and cloths used around food, had to be hung far from where they slept. No one was allowed to leave camp alone after dark. If they saw wolves, the group had to stay close together, remain calm, and never run. Those instructions quickly faded into the background once the trip truly began. The first day was clear, with light wind and a sky so blue that every mountain ridge appeared sharp. The route followed Seneca Lake, then continued through low meadows where the grass had turned yellow-brown. Priya stopped often to photograph the mountains reflected in the water. Marcus would walk several dozen steps ahead, wait for the rest, then pretend to complain that they were ruining his speed record. Julia stayed near Derek, asking the names of plants and how to identify elk tracks. Derek kept the pace moderate, so the group would not spend too much energy during the first few hours. He knew excitement could make new hikers move faster than their bodies could handle, especially as the elevation increased. Every hour, he stopped the group briefly so they could drink and eat a little. By early afternoon, they had crossed the longest climb of the day without anyone showing signs of altitude sickness. Priya still spoke comfortably. Marcus still had enough energy to sing the wrong words to an old song. Julia complained only that her backpack strap was rubbing her shoulder. They made their first night's camp on open ground near the tree line, a short distance from the main trail. Derek chose a relatively level site away from dead trees and far enough from the water's edge. He showed them how to set up 2 small tents with the entrances facing the center, then went with Marcus to hang the food bag from a solid branch more than 100 feet from camp. They used a rope to pull the bag high, making sure it stayed away from the trunk and beyond the reach of animals. Derek checked the wind direction, the moisture in the wood, and the distance between the tents before allowing everyone to settle in. To him, those small details created the kind of safety that clients only noticed when a night in the mountains began turning strange. After dinner, Derek built a small fire inside an existing stone ring. He did not like large fires, but in late September, steady heat helped maintain morale and created a clear boundary around camp. They gathered dry fallen branches from the ground and divided them into 2 piles, one for immediate use and a reserve pile about 15 feet from the fire, far enough to avoid sparks but close enough to reach quickly. The first night passed quietly. They heard light wind in the canopy, water touching the rocky shore, and one distant howl from the north. Marcus looked up immediately, but Derek only explained that it could be one wolf calling its pack or locating itself within the territory. The sound did not repeat. There were no signs around camp. The group continued talking until the fire burned low, then went into the tents one by one. The following morning, the temperature was close to freezing, but the sky was clear. Frost covered the grass and tent edges. Derek woke first, added wood to the remaining coals, and checked the area around camp. He found deer tracks, squirrel marks, and one line of smaller prints that may have belonged to a fox. There were no wolf tracks near the tents. The food bag was untouched. When the others woke, the smell of hot coffee and oatmeal quickly pushed away the cold. The second day was the most beautiful part of the trip. The route carried them deeper into the basin, where long lakes rested between high rock walls. Sunlight reflected across the water, while old snow remained in the mountain cracks. Priya said the view made every photograph look fake, like a computer background. Julia only sat at the edge of one lake, removed her boots, and placed her feet in the cold water for several seconds before pulling them out at once. A good trip does not need extraordinary stories. It only needs cooperative weather, working equipment, people willing to follow instructions, and enough time to appreciate the place they worked to reach. The first 2 days had all of that. No one was injured. Nothing was lost. The satellite communication device held a steady signal. The updated forecast showed a colder third night but no storm. While the group rested for lunch on the second day, Derek pointed out an old wolf track in mud near the creek. It was larger than the print of an ordinary house dog, with 4 tight toes, a clear pad, and a direct line of travel. Marcus asked whether the pack might be tracking them. Derek explained that the possibility was very low. Wolves could know people were in an area long before the people knew wolves were near, but they usually moved away. Even so, Derek paid closer attention to signs along the route. He knew 2 large wolf packs had traveled through the area late in the season, when elk began moving lower and animal groups shifted their range. Data from tracking collars had shown their territories overlapping in several valleys west of Titcomb Basin. Derek always avoided setting camp near animal remains, hunting paths, or places with large amounts of fresh sign. That afternoon, they continued several more miles and chose their final camp on a wide area near the edge of the lake, where low grass and stone provided a clear view in every direction. Derek circled the site before allowing the tents to go up. He found no dead animals, drag marks, hair, or fresh scat. The wind direction was steady. Water was close, but not too close. The trees behind the site offered enough protection from the wind, and no dead trunks leaned toward the camp. They arranged the tents in a half circle around the fire area. The food bag was hung farther away than it had been the previous night, because several large trees nearby made that possible. Derek checked the knots twice, then marked the path with small reflective strips so no one would get lost after dark. He placed the satellite device in his chest pocket where he could reach it immediately, and kept the bear spray beside his seat. The group had settled into the rhythm of the trip. Their bodies were less sore, and the early distance between guide and clients had nearly disappeared. Priya told them about the time she became lost inside a conference center, even though maps were posted at every corner. Marcus used the story as proof that she should never be allowed to lead. Julia offered several examples showing that Marcus was no more trustworthy. Around 9 o'clock, they heard a howl from the west. This one was closer than the sound from the previous night, but still distant enough to feel like part of the landscape. Another howl answered from the north almost a minute later. Derek listened and decided the sounds were not approaching camp. Still, he placed another log on the fire and checked that the food bag remained where it belonged. The final day was reserved for a short hike around the upper lakes before returning to camp by late afternoon. Derek wanted the group to have time to rest, eat enough, and prepare for the hike out of the basin the following morning. The wind carried the dry cold of approaching snow, although the forecast still showed no significant accumulation. Priya spent more time taking photographs. Marcus found a rock ledge where he could sit and look across the basin. Julia helped Derek filter water and check the stove. No one spoke about danger. The howls from the previous 2 nights had become an interesting detail, not a warning. To them, the wolves were only distant shapes beyond the edge of their experience. Derek followed the same routine. Before sunset, he rehung the food, gathered more wood, checked the stone ring, and told everyone to keep their boots and jackets where they could reach them easily. He selected a fallen dead tree, split several smaller sections, and placed the reserve pile about 15 feet from the fire. They lit the fire earlier because the temperature was falling quickly. When darkness settled over Titcomb Basin, the 4 of them sat around the flames, feeling that they had completed a successful trip. They talked about the first meal they would eat after returning to town, hot showers, and the photographs Priya would send. Everyone. None of them knew that in the western forest, several animals were moving through the same strip of terrain. The first 2 days had taught them to believe the wilderness still followed familiar rules: maintain distance, store food, keep a fire, and respect wildlife. Derek believed it too. 10 years of experience had never given him any reason to think the final night would be different. At 10 o'clock, as the flames began to lower and the group prepared to enter their tents, Priya suddenly lifted her head. From the west, a long howl moved across the lake, clearer and closer than any sound they had heard during the previous 2 nights. The 3rd night in Titcomb Basin began so peacefully that no one in the group felt the need to lower their voice. The campfire burned steadily inside the stone ring, throwing orange light across 4 faces already used to cold wind, trail dust, and the slower rhythm of the high country. Derek Sutton sat closest to the edge of the fire, both hands open toward the heat, while Priya Anand pulled deeper into her jacket. Marcus Bell had just finished telling a story about the time he burned dinner in his apartment, and Julia Hale was gathering the metal cups to put them away. Around 10 o'clock that night, wind moved off the lake and passed through camp, carrying the smell of cold water and wet stone. The fire leaned east, then rose straight again. Priya was the first to look up. She did not speak right away. She only turned her face toward the west, where the pine forest formed a dark wall beneath the mountain slope. A long howl traveled across the water, clearer than anything they had heard during the previous 2 nights. It was no longer a distant call blending into the landscape. The sound had depth, closeness, and a weight that stopped every conversation around the fire. Priya looked at Derek. He did not appear panicked, but his posture had changed. His back was straighter, and his head tilted slightly as he worked out the direction. The howl continued for several more seconds, then ended. The space afterward was quiet enough for them to hear pine resin popping inside the fire. Derek knew one howl alone did not mean much. Wolves could be calling the pack, announcing location, or maintaining contact across a territory. But that sound had been closer than he wanted, and it came from the west, the same area where a large pack had been documented before. Less than half a minute later, another howl answered from the north. It was higher and shorter, then immediately followed by a third sound from the south-southwest. Marcus turned around, trying to judge the distance, but in mountain country at night, sound often bounced from rock walls and water, making the true direction difficult to identify. Derek did not trust the first impression. He listened to the rhythm, the time between each call, and the way one sound appeared after the last. A fourth howl came from the southeast. 4 directions. Derek understood this was no longer one wolf or a pair moving through the area. The howls were being used to gather and locate one another. He had heard that kind of communication during winter surveys, when a large pack separated to hunt and called before coming together again. What bothered him was that the group appeared to be near the center of those directions. He kept his voice calm as he told everyone to sit closer together and pull their backpacks and personal gear into the light. Derek did not tell them to run into the tents. A tent was only thin fabric and provided no real barrier. Splitting the group now would make the situation harder to control. He checked the bear spray, took a high-powered flashlight from his bag, and placed the satellite communication device within reach. Then he added 2 logs to the fire. Another howl sounded, this time closer from the north. 2 replies came almost at once. Marcus stopped joking. He moved closer to Julia and held a piece of firewood as though it could serve as a weapon. Priya watched the edge of the light, where tree trunks appeared only as motionless black columns. She began to sense movement out there, though she could not tell whether it was branches shifting or actual animals. Derek rose slowly. He did not want sudden movement to trigger any animal watching them. He swept the flashlight in a low circle around camp, never holding the beam too long in one direction. At first, the light caught only brush, rock, and pale pine trunks. Then, at the western edge, 2 small points of light appeared and vanished. Derek moved the beam back. The 2 points appeared again, level with each other, and lower than the knee of a standing adult. A pair of eyes. They reflected the flashlight in a pale yellow color, then angled aside when the animal turned its head. The distance was about 70 feet, far enough not to be an immediate threat, but much closer than any wolf Derek had ever encountered while guiding clients. He did not say the distance aloud. He only told the group to stay where they were, not stare, not run, and not leave the firelight. Priya heard the change in the way Derek spoke. His voice remained steady, but the sentences were shorter, with none of the extra explanation. It was the voice of someone moving from guiding into managing danger. The eyes to the west disappeared behind a tree. Almost immediately, another pair appeared to the north, then another to the south. They did not stand at equal distances. One animal remained almost 100 feet away. Another moved closer before stopping. The firelight made their eyes appear and disappear like small lights opening and closing along the edge of the dark. Derek began counting silently. 1 west, 1 north, 1 south. Then 2 more between those directions. 5 wolves, or at least 5 separate positions. He knew reflected eyes could mislead, because one fast-moving animal might seem like 2. So he did not give the number to the others. He kept watching the paths, remembering where each pair of eyes vanished and where it returned. Within 10 minutes, the howling faded. That did not make Derek feel better. When wolves still called from a distance, it meant they had not fully gathered. The silence afterwards suggested they were close enough not to need loud communication. Now and then, he heard claws touch rock, old snow compress beneath paws, and a short breath taken away by the wind. Priya sat close beside Julia, both knees drawn beneath her coat. She realized the pack's quiet was worse than the howling. Without sound, the mind filled every dark space. Every trunk could hide a body. Every small movement in a branch could be an animal changing position. The fire which had made the previous 2 nights feel warm and comfortable now seemed like a circle of light far too small for the land around it. After sending the signal, Derek checked the amount of wood left inside the fire ring. The main reserve pile stood about 15 feet away, outside the strongest light. Under normal conditions, that distance meant nothing. Now it looked like dangerous open ground. He dragged the closest pieces inward with his boot, trying not to step fully beyond the fire. The wood would keep the flames going for a while, but not through the night if they needed a large fire. A pair of eyes appeared beside the woodpile. Julia saw them first and grabbed Priya's arm. The animal stood low, part of the body hidden in darkness. Firelight brushed across a long muzzle and upright ears. The wolf did not touch the wood or move toward the people. It only stood there and watched. Derek aimed the flashlight. The wolf backed away several steps, then stopped just outside the light, as though it understood exactly how far away it needed to remain before the group had trouble responding. A second pair of eyes appeared to its right, then a third, farther away. Derek counted again. He was now certain there were at least 7 separate animals. 2 to the west still held position. 1 in the north moved behind a rock. 3 stood near the firewood, and 1 remained to the south. The number was higher than he had expected from the first howls. A pack of 7 was not unusual in the region, but an entire pack deliberately approaching a camp with people and fire was something he had never handled directly. Priya asked whether the wolves were hungry. Derek did not pretend to know. The food had been hung far away, but human scent, smoke, sweat, and footprints covered the campsite. The wolves might have been curious. They might have been examining something unfamiliar inside their territory. There could also have been a natural food source nearby that the group had not discovered. The important thing was not to let them see panic or separation. 2 more pairs of eyes appeared from the east. 9. Derek still did not let his expression change. He added wood, checked the wind direction, and told everyone to watch separate sections instead of all 4 looking the same way. Priya covered the west. Marcus watched the north. Julia watched the south, while Derek scanned the east and the spaces between. Giving each person a simple task helped them feel they were doing something and kept fear from turning into panic. Over the next 5 minutes, the pack closed the distance. None of the wolves charged. They only moved sideways, vanished behind a tree, then appeared several feet closer. The change was so slow that without marking their positions against rocks and trunks, a person might think they were standing still. Priya noticed that one wolf in the west had shifted from behind a large pine to the front of a low bush. The distance had dropped from nearly 70 feet to about 50. Another wolf moved closer from the north, head low, shoulders rolling smoothly beneath thick fur. The fire turned its eyes yellow-orange. When Derek shined the flashlight directly at it, the wolf looked aside but did not retreat. Two behind it also stopped at the same time, showing more coordination than a group of individually curious animals. The fire rose suddenly when one dry log caught. For several seconds, multiple bodies became visible along the edge of camp. Priya saw gray backs, long legs, low tails, and heads turning away from the brighter light at the same moment. She counted 3 in front, 2 on the left, and at least 2 behind the tents. When the flames dropped, the bodies disappeared into shadow again, leaving only reflected eyes. Derek counted 10. He checked again, waiting for positions to change so he would not count the same wolf twice. 10 pairs of eyes appeared in 10 separate places, covering almost the entire campsite. That number was beyond anything he considered normal for the situation. A pack of 10 could exist, but the coordinated approach and the way they held a curved formation around the fire did not look like random travel. He began to understand that the group was no longer observing wildlife. They had become the center of an assessment. Priya felt that change without Derek needing to explain it. The wolves were not watching the food bag hanging in the distance. They were not focused on one direction where a dead animal might lie. Every gaze pointed toward the light where 4 people sat close together. The wolves had not attacked, but they also had not left when confronted with flashlights, human voices, or fire. Marcus gripped the piece of firewood in both hands. Julia was breathing faster. Though she tried to stay quiet, Priya kept swallowing because her throat had gone dry. Derek looked at each of them and reminded them to slow their breathing, not shout, and not throw anything outside unless a wolf entered the danger zone. He knew calm was no longer a feeling. It was a task they had to maintain through effort. A low growl sounded from the west. Another answered from the north. These were not howls used to call the pack. They were close-range communication. The reflected eyes shifted again. 11. Then one final pair appeared behind the southern rock. 12. Derek counted 3 more times. The number stayed the same. 12 separate wolves stood around the camp, and none was more than 60 feet from the fire. He did not say the number aloud at first. In 10 years of guiding, he had never known a situation that began with 12 wolves deliberately moving toward a group of people at night. 20 minutes had passed since the first howl. The easy mood of the trip was gone. The fire still burned, but the darkness beyond it felt heavier, now that they knew exactly how many bodies stood inside it. Derek looked at the reserve woodpile, then at the ring of yellow eyes closing in. He understood that the night had moved beyond everything he had been trained to handle. And the wolves were still coming closer. If you're wondering how 4 people could survive that night, follow the channel now, because the next part brings us to the moment Priya said she would never forget for as long as she lived. A like also helps me bring you more stories like this. Now let's return to that circle of fire. Near midnight, the circle of light around Camp Hedgehuan shrunk until it barely covered the 4 people and the tents behind them. The fire, which had burned steadily and brightly earlier that evening, was now reduced to several red logs at the center. From time to time, a small flame lifted, then faded again. Beyond the edge of the light, 12 pairs of yellow-orange eyes formed an almost complete circle. No wolf stood more than 30 feet from the fire. They did not come closer, but they did not retreat. Derek Sutton crouched beside the stone ring, holding the bear spray in one hand and the flashlight in the other. He divided the circle into 4 sections and memorized each wolf by the rocks, tents, and pine trunks around it. 3 to the west, 2 to the north, 4 to the east, 3 to the south. 12 separate wolves. There was no mistake. Priya, Marcus, and Julia stayed pressed together behind Derek. Julia wrapped both arms tightly around her chest, trying to stop shaking, though she no longer knew whether it came from the cold or fear. Derek had procedures for dangerous situations in the mountains, but none of his training manuals described 4 people surrounded at night by 12 gray wolves in a basin more than 12 trail miles from the nearest ranger station. He kept his voice calm and told everyone to stay close, hold their positions, and not run into the tents. The tents were only fabric and offered no real protection. If one person panicked and moved away from the fire, the pack might react immediately. He reminded them to keep the flashlights aimed low and not shine them continuously into the wolves' eyes, which could provoke them. Priya realized the wolves were watching not only each person but also the fire. Whenever a log collapsed and the light weakened, 2 or 3 wolves at the edge of the circle moved a few inches closer. When Derek used a stick to push the coals together and the flames rose, they stopped. They were not frightened by the light. They only adjusted their distance enough to remain outside the hottest part. The pack did not look wild with hunger. They were patient. They waited for the fire to weaken on its own, for the people to grow tired, and for one small mistake. Whenever the lead wolf changed position, several others moved with him. The reserve woodpile sat about 15 feet from the fire ring. It had become a stretch of open ground no one dared cross. Marcus suggested making a quick run to grab an armful of wood and come back. Derek rejected the idea immediately. 15 feet could be covered in a few seconds, but the person would have to bend down, turn his back, and use both hands to lift the wood. Derek checked what remained within reach. 3 medium logs, a small amount of kindling, 2 partly burned pieces of wood, and several pine sticks they had, gathered that afternoon. Used carefully, they might keep the coals alive for another hour or longer. But there was not enough to maintain a bright defensive fire until morning. Derek considered using the bear spray to open a path. Its effective range was short, and the wind kept shifting across the lake. If he sprayed at the wrong moment, the chemical could blow back into camp and leave all 4 of them unable to see. 1 canister would also not be enough to stop 12 wolves approaching from several directions. He had emergency flares in his bag, but only 2. The satellite communication device had sent an emergency signal, but Derek did not know whether the alert had been received, or whether search and rescue could leave during the night. The terrain around Titcomb Basin was difficult after dark. Even if a ranger station received the signal immediately, no one could reach them for several hours. Julia began breathing faster. At first, the breaths were only short, but soon her shoulders were rising repeatedly, and her hands tightened until the knuckles turned white. Priya noticed and reached for her wrist. Julia was not crying, but her eyes were wide and kept moving from one pair of eyes to another. In a low voice, she asked whether the wolves would rush them when the fire went out. Derek turned to look at her. He did not offer a promise he could not keep. He only said the pack was still evaluating them, and the group still had an advantage as long as they held formation, maintained light, and kept using human voices. The answer was more careful than empty reassurance, but Julia still heard what remained unsaid beneath it. Derek did not know what would happen. Priya tightened her grip on Julia's hand and told her to look at her instead of staring into the dark. She guided Julia through slow breaths, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, a technique Priya had used when dealing with anxiety. Julia tried to follow, but every scrape of claws against stone broke the rhythm. Marcus shifted farther toward the outside, as if trying to place part of his body between the wolves and the 2 women. He said that if the pack meant to attack, they would have done it already, but the words did not sound natural. 1 wolf to the south moved forward to about 25 feet. Derek immediately rose halfway, widened his shoulders, and aimed the flashlight at the ground in front of the animal. In a loud voice, he ordered it to back away. The wolf stopped, its ears pulling slightly behind its head. That response made Derek feel relieved and more worried at the same time. The pack still showed some caution around people, but that caution was weakening. They were growing used to the voices, flashlights, and movement around the fire. He added another log. The flames rose for several minutes, revealing the bodies of many wolves. Their gray-brown coats were thick. Their shoulders stood high, their legs were long, and their muzzles were broader than those of coyotes. The lead wolf remained still in the weak light, eyes reflecting yellow-orange, head held slightly low. Derek counted again while the fire allowed him to see. 12. There were no very small pups, though several younger wolves stayed farther back. The formation suggested a large family pack, or two related groups that had come together. By 11:40, the circle had tightened further. The nearest wolves stood less than 30 feet from the flames. They were distributed almost evenly in every direction, leaving very few open spaces. The wind off the lake grew colder. Priya felt the cold rising through the ground beneath her sitting pad. Still, no one considered going into a tent for more clothing. The fire dropped again. One log collapsed into the center of the stone ring, throwing a few sparks before leaving only red coals. Priya saw 3 wolves step forward. At the same time, none crossed the 30-foot boundary. But their coordination was impossible to miss. When Derek stirred the coals with a pine stick, they stopped. Julia began shaking harder. She remained quiet, but tears ran down both cheeks because her body could no longer hide what fear was doing to it. Derek considered having the whole group move to the woodpile together, 4 people staying close, using flashlights and bear spray to face outward, collecting wood, then backing toward the fire. But the wolves surrounded them on every side. There was no direction where they could safely turn their backs. Going into the tents was just as useless. 4 adults could not fit inside one small tent with their equipment. Splitting between 2 tents would leave them unable to see one another. If the wolves approached, the fabric would block the people's view without stopping teeth or claws. Derek considered making loud noise with the metal cookware, but the wolves had already listened to voices, whistles, and flashlights for almost 2 hours. He needed something strong enough to create real space, not merely a few seconds. The reserve woodpile stood out there, like a reminder of one small failure in an otherwise careful plan. But Derek had never planned for a large wolf pack to position itself directly between his group and their firewood. Near midnight, Priya felt as if time had stopped. Each minute was measured by the size of the flames and the position of the eyes. The wolves did not need to hurry. They knew the people were losing warmth, light, and alertness. Their waiting did not resemble sudden aggression. It felt like a calculation. The lead wolf moved forward a short distance. Its chest became clearer in the red light. The tail remained low, the head level with the shoulders, and the eyes never left the group. Derek stood fully upright. Marcus rose with him, holding the knife in front of his body. Priya and Julia tried to stand, but Derek signaled for them to remain close to the fire. He shouted in the hardest voice he could produce, but the wolf only stopped. It did not back away. Derek recognized that an important boundary had changed. Earlier, human voices and standing tall still made the wolves give up distance. Now the lead wolf had become used to both. It was testing whether the human boundary was real or whether it existed only because of light. Another wolf to the east stepped forward. Then a third to the south. The circle tightened by several inches, almost impossible to notice without watching continuously. Derek lowered one hand toward the flare pouch. He did not take one out yet, but if he waited too long, there might not be enough distance left to use it safely. Julia began losing control of her breathing again. Priya leaned close and reminded her to focus on the warmth against her hands and the sound of Priya's voice. Julia nodded, but kept staring at the lead wolf. She whispered that he knew the fire was going out. Derek placed the final log within reach onto the coals. The fire caught slowly, producing only a few small orange tongues. The reserve pile 15 feet away still held enough wood for the whole night, but no one could reach it without stepping out of the safe circle. 12 pairs of eyes remained around them. No howling, no loud growls, only breathing, claws shifting on stone, and the coals cracking inside the fire ring. The quiet made the four of them feel that the pack was not only waiting for the fire to die. The wolves were waiting for the people to understand that they had no choices left. As Derek studied the circle, he tried to find a pattern in the way the pack had positioned itself. The younger wolves usually remained behind the others, moving more often and more quickly, while 4 adults held fixed points around camp. The lead wolf did not need to keep giving vocal commands. A single turn of the head, a sideways step, or a lowering of the muzzle was enough to make the others change position. Derek had seen wolves coordinate in survey footage and through tracks in the field, but he had never observed the behavior close enough to see every small response. Priya also noticed that the wolves showed no interest in the food bag hanging in the distance. None left the circle to examine it, even when the wind sometimes carried the smell toward camp. Their attention remained inside the firelight. That made it difficult to believe they were simply attracted by food. They were watching the 4 people, especially whenever someone shifted position or extended a hand beyond the light. Julia tried to hold herself together through small tasks. She counted the pops from the fire, pressed her feet together, and repeated the names of everyone in the group. But every time a pair of eyes appeared closer, her concentration broke. Priya felt that Julia's hand was cold and wet with sweat. She kept holding it, not because she believed she could remove Julia's fear, but because the contact reminded both of them that they had not been separated. Derek checked the satellite device again. The screen confirmed that the signal had been sent, but it gave no estimated rescue time. In daylight, even a fast team would need several hours to hike in. At night, over rock, creeks, and cold sections of trail that might be icing over, it would take longer. No one outside knew how close the wolves had come. The signal only said the group needed help. It could not communicate the feeling of 12 pairs of eyes patiently waiting for the fire to go out. Derek understood that from this point forward, the goal was no longer to drive the wolves away. It was only to keep the group intact until morning. He looked in every direction one last time, considered every option, then reached the conclusion he did not want to admit. Human strength alone could not break that circle without exposing a weakness. There was nowhere to run, no solid shelter, not enough wood within reach, and no rescue team that could arrive in time. The lead wolf took another step as the fire faded, and from the pine forest behind the tents, the ground began to tremble. Just as the campfire faded to a weak red bed of coals, the lead wolf lifted one front paw and took another step forward. Less than 30 feet remained between him and Derek. His yellow-orange eyes stayed fixed on the 4 people gathered tightly around the stone ring without blinking. Derek already had one hand on the flare pouch. Marcus held the knife in front of his chest. Then the ground shook behind the tents. The first vibration was so slight that Priya thought a log had collapsed inside the coals, but the stone ring did not move. A second pulse came several seconds later, deeper this time, traveling through the frozen ground beneath her sitting pad. Derek turned toward the tents. All 12 wolves reacted at once. Their ears rose high. Every muzzle turned away from the group and pointed toward the dark wall of trees behind camp. The lead wolf stopped in the middle of his step. His front paw stayed off the ground for a moment, then lowered more slowly. 2 wolves to the east moved sideways, opening a gap in the circle. One of the younger animals released a low whine and pressed his body close to the ground. The change happened so quickly that Derek did not need to explain it. The wolves had detected something powerful enough to make them forget the 4 people and the dying fire. A pine branch behind the tents shook hard. Old snow and dry needles fell across the tent roofs in a long, rustling shower. Then came a deep compression, like a heavy foot pressing into the forest floor. Another followed. The steps came at even intervals, slow and steady, moving directly toward camp. Priya saw the outline before she understood what she was looking at. A black form, separated from the pine forest, tall enough that the head nearly touched the lower branches. The Bigfoot walked on 2 legs. He did not crawl or shift weight the way a bear might while standing temporarily upright. The upper body leaned slightly forward, but the spine remained balanced and straight. Each step sent a light vibration through the ground beneath Priya's knees. The Bigfoot moved behind the tents, then entered the weak orange-red light from the coals. No one spoke. He stood more than 8.5 feet tall. Even after entering the open ground, his knees remained slightly bent and his neck angled forward, which meant his full height may have been greater. His shoulders were so wide that when he passed in front of the fire, his body blocked almost all the light behind him and darkened the entire campsite for several seconds. Hair covered his whole body, dark brown and nearly black in the weak firelight. The hair over the shoulders was much thicker, rising into a heavy mass whenever his chest expanded. Along the nape and down the spine, the hair stood upright. It was not moving with the wind. It looked like a warning response. His long arms hung almost to the knees. The forearms were thick, the wrists broad, and the hands much larger than human hands. The fingers remained partly curled, not fully closed, leaving a hooked space as though they were ready to grab, push, or hold something. The Bigfoot took 3 more steps and stopped between the tents and the wolf pack. He stood with his back to the 4 people and faced the ring of yellow eyes surrounding camp. The position he chose was so exact that his body became a living wall. If the wolves wanted to reach the fire or the people from the west, they would have to pass him first. The lead wolf released a low growl. The same sound that had made Julia shake for nearly 2 hours now seemed small in front of the body that had just appeared. The wolf lowered his head and exposed his teeth, but did not come any closer. The others shifted. Several backed behind trees. For the first time that night, the complete circle broke apart. The Bigfoot tilted his head to the left. His neck looked extremely short, or perhaps the thick hair hid most of it. When he turned, the coals caught the side of his face. Priya saw it for only a second, but that was enough to know he was not a bear. The forehead was low and sloped back. A thick brow ridge projected over the eyes. The nose was broad and flatter than a human nose, but the face did not extend into a muzzle. The lower jaw was large, heavy, and almost square. The eyes sat deep beneath the brow. Firelight did not make them shine the way the wolf's eyes did. Priya caught only a dark brown glint when the Bigfoot looked toward the wolves on the eastern side, then returned his attention to the leader. That difference frightened her more. 12 pairs of eyes around camp shone like points of light. The Bigfoot's eyes held depth, focus, and the appearance of judgment. Derek did not know which danger he should respond to first. The wolves still surrounded the campsite, but the largest being he had ever seen stood less than 20 feet away. The bear spray in his hand suddenly felt useless. A flare might frighten or provoke the Bigfoot. Derek understood that one wrong move could turn the barrier standing in front of them into a new threat. He signaled for everyone to remain silent. Marcus had lowered the knife without realizing it. Julia had stopped crying, but her body had locked in place. Priya felt as if her own breathing were too loud, though in reality, each breath was only a short pull caught in her throat. No one dared turn toward the tents, reach for a backpack, or make any movement that might draw the Bigfoot's attention. The lead wolf moved 1 step sideways. The Bigfoot turned half of his upper body in the same direction. His feet stayed planted, but the right shoulder dropped. and the arm on that side moved away from the body. The fingers curled tighter. He watched the lead wolf while keeping the others in view with very small turns of his head. One wolf to the north moved forward. The Bigfoot shifted his weight onto the left leg. The ground beneath Priya trembled lightly as the right foot moved half a step. That single adjustment closed the opening between his body and a nearby tree, removing the wolf's direct path into camp. The wolf stopped, ears pressed back. Derek realized the Bigfoot was not standing there by accident. He was reading the pack's formation. The lead wolf raised his muzzle and released a longer growl. Two wolves to his right began spreading outward. The hair over the Bigfoot's shoulders rose higher. He lowered his head, bent his knees slightly, and widened both arms. The posture made his already enormous body appear broader, completely covering the fire behind him. Then he roared. The sound came once, without breaking. It began as a deep vibration in the chest, so low that Priya felt it through the ground before her ears fully recognized it. Then it grew, spreading into a long band of sound that traveled through the campsite, across the lake, and into the surrounding rock slopes. It did not sound like a bear. It did not sound like an elk. It was nothing like the howl of a wolf. The roar carried the weight of a massive body, resonating from deep inside. Priya felt the earth beneath her continue to tremble. A metal cup beside the backpack shifted slightly across the rock. Julia lifted both hands and covered her mouth, not because the sound was sharp, but because her body reacted as if she were standing in the path of a physical shock wave. The roar lasted only several seconds, but to Priya it felt much longer. The final note dropped lower, moved through the ground, then ended abruptly. The space afterward seemed to pull every sound out of the forest. No wind, no water, no insects. Only the Bigfoot's heavy breathing and the small cracking of coals inside the stone ring. All 12 wolves stepped back at the same time. Their eyes remained on the Bigfoot, but their posture had changed completely. Many had their ears pressed flat against the head. Their tails dropped lower. The younger wolves at the rear moved deeper into the trees. The circle that had left the 4 people without an escape now opened into several dark gaps. The lead wolf remained. He kept his head low, his front feet spread apart, and his lips pulled away from his teeth. The difference in size was so extreme that numbers suddenly seemed less important. The Bigfoot did not move toward him. He stood still with his shoulders open and his arms lowered but not relaxed. His head tilted slightly, and his eyes remained on the lead wolf. It did not look like a hunting posture. It looked like a warning had been delivered, and now he was waiting for the answer. The lead wolf gave a short growl. The Bigfoot did not answer. He simply lifted his upper body and stood almost fully upright. In that moment, Derek saw his true height. The top of his head rose so far above the tent stakes that Derek no longer doubted the estimate of 8.5 feet. His shoulders blocked almost all the firelight, forming one enormous black shape against the red coals. The lead wolf lowered his tail. He backed up one step, stopped, then backed up again. The 2 closest wolves withdrew at once. One wolf to the south turned sideways and ran low into the forest. The others began leaving their positions, not all at the exact same moment, but in a chain moving around the circle. Derek counted by reflex as the reflected eyes disappeared. 12 became 10, then 8, 6. The yellow-orange points moved farther between the trees each time the wolves turned their heads. None crossed past the Bigfoot toward camp. None attempted to circle behind the tents. The lead wolf was the last to leave the light. He stood at the edge of the forest, his body reduced to a faint gray outline. His eyes still reflected the glow from the coals. The Bigfoot did not lower his shoulders. He did not turn around. After several seconds, the wolf tilted his head, then disappeared behind a pine trunk. The pack's footsteps moved farther away. One short howl sounded in the distance and was not answered immediately. At last, the forest became quiet again. The 4 people still did not move. Derek did not yet trust that the siege was over. The Bigfoot remained with his back toward the group, standing between camp and the forest like a living pillar. His long arms hung at his sides. The fingers slowly opened, but the shoulders remained raised. Priya saw his breath rise in large white clouds. Each time the chest expanded, the thick hair over the shoulders moved as one heavy mass. The red coals outlined his back and arms in reddish-brown, while the rest of his body blended into darkness. He did not turn around to receive their attention. The four people behind him seemed to be only part of the ground he had chosen to hold. Marcus looked at Derek, waiting for instructions, but Derek did not know what to do either. He did not want the Bigfoot to think they were moving closer, and he did not want to create noise that might bring the wolves back. They sat in complete silence. Several minutes later, the Bigfoot tilted his head toward the west, where the final howl had faded. He stepped forward once. The ground beneath camp trembled again. But he did not enter the forest. He only shifted to the center of the opening the wolves had used before, facing outward with his back still toward the people. Derek lowered the bear spray beside his foot. The Bigfoot did not react. Marcus placed the knife on the ground. Priya felt Julia begin breathing more evenly, though her entire body remained stiff. The coals continued to weaken. Under ordinary circumstances, Derek would have added wood immediately, but the reserve pile remained outside the stone ring, close to the Bigfoot's left side. He did not dare stand yet. Still, for the first time in almost 2 hours, no yellow eyes watched them from the dark. That safety was harder to understand than the fear. The Bigfoot could turn at any moment. He was close enough to reach the group in only a few strides, but every part of his posture remained directed outward. His back was fully exposed to the four people, a position a wild animal would normally avoid if humans were considered an immediate threat. Priya looked at the broad outline of his shoulders and understood that what amazed her most was not that the wolves had retreated. It was the place the Bigfoot chose to stand after the roar. He did not chase the pack to hunt them. He did not turn toward camp to search for food. He did not disappear into the forest after the danger had passed. He stayed. The Bigfoot stood more than 8.5 feet tall in front of the campsite, his back blocking the red light from the coals, and his face turned toward the forest where 12 wolves had withdrawn. None of the four people behind him spoke. No one dared breathe deeply, and in that frozen silence, they began to understand that the Bigfoot had not merely stepped between two sides. He had chosen one. The Bigfoot remained at the edge of the firelight after the last wolf disappeared between the pines. His back stayed turned toward the four people, long arms hanging at his sides, head tilted slightly toward the western forest, as though he were listening to sounds human ears could not detect. The fire had fallen to red coals, but no one dared move during those first few minutes. Derek Sutton kept the bear spray beside his leg. Marcus left the knife on the ground. Priya and Julia sat so close their shoulders touched. All four understood that the wolves were gone, but the one standing between them and the darkness was larger than everything that had terrified them moments before. Derek was the first to realize the Bigfoot had no intention of turning toward camp. He held the exact position he had chosen when he stepped out, blocking the space between the tents and the direction the wolves had taken. Whenever wind passed through the trees, his head moved slightly with the leaves. When a dry branch broke somewhere far away, his shoulders rose, then lowered. Not one movement was directed at the four people. Slowly, that stillness began to mean something different. He did not look like a predator waiting for an opening. He looked like a night watchman who had never been asked to stand guard. About 15 minutes passed before Derek decided they had to add more wood. The coals inside the stone ring were dying fast, and the temperature kept falling. The reserve pile lay about 15 feet away, to the left of the Bigfoot. Derek signaled for the other three to stay where they were, then stood very slowly. The Bigfoot did not turn. Derek took one step and stopped, waiting for a reaction. Nothing happened except white breath rising past the Bigfoot's shoulders. Derek took another step, bent down, picked up 2 logs, and backed toward the fire without turning around. When the first log touched the coals, several sparks rose. The Bigfoot tilted his head slightly, but continued watching the forest. Derek added the second piece. The wood caught slowly, then formed a small band of orange flame. The light widened and revealed the Bigfoot's dark brown back, powerful lower legs, and deep footprints beside a thin patch of snow. Priya could see his body more clearly, though his face remained completely hidden. She did not feel comfortable, but her fear was no longer the same as before. It had been replaced by caution, confusion, and something close to gratitude. Julia still did not move from her place, but her breathing had become steadier. She stopped staring at the Bigfoot's back and focused instead on the fire, holding both hands near. The heat. No one spoke loudly. Anything necessary was exchanged in brief whispers, as if the group feared breaking an unspoken agreement between the campsite and the guard standing beyond it. During the next hour, the Bigfoot barely left his position. But when Derek watched carefully, he realized the Bigfoot was not completely still. Every few minutes he shifted one step left or right, checking the dark spaces between the trees. Sometimes he moved about 10 feet beyond the fire, stopped at the edge of the darkness, then returned. Those movements created a curved route around the outside of the tents. Each time he came back, he stood in a slightly different place, but always kept the campsite behind him and the forest ahead. Priya clearly remembered how strange that period felt. They were still trapped deep in the mountains, still hours away from rescue, and still sitting near a Bigfoot whose identity none of them could name with certainty. But for the first time since the eyes appeared, they could sit without constantly waiting for a charge. The fire was burning again. Julia managed several swallows of water. Marcus opened a bag, took out an energy bar, and divided it into 4 pieces. No one ate with any appetite, but their bodies began functioning like people trying to survive the night instead of prey frozen by fear. Derek checked the satellite communication device. The emergency signal had been confirmed as received. There was no exact arrival time, but at least someone outside knew their location. Derek told the group. Julia closed her eyes for several seconds and her shoulders lowered. Marcus breathed out slowly. Priya looked toward the Bigfoot and thought that if he left then, the wolves might return before search and rescue arrived. But he did not leave. 1 o'clock passed, then 2. The Bigfoot continued standing guard. Sometimes he remained nearly motionless for 10 minutes at a time. Sometimes he walked in a broad curve from the north side toward the west, placing each heavy step on the ground. Whenever he did, Derek heard snow compress and felt a very light vibration. He began memorizing the route, though he did not know it would matter later. The path did not cross through camp, and it was not random. It formed a perimeter outside the tents and repeated several times. No one slept. They took turns adding wood, drinking water, and watching. Julia sometimes rested her head against Priya's shoulder, eyes closed but still awake. Marcus sat across from them with both hands wrapped around a metal cup that had already gone cold. Derek always kept one person watching the forest while another tended the fire, but as the night continued, he realized the Bigfoot was doing that job more effectively than anyone in the group. Every small sound beyond the light brought a reaction from him before any human noticed it. Near 3 in the morning, the wind changed. Smoke drifted toward the Bigfoot and surrounded his body in a thin layer. He stepped left to avoid it, then resumed his watch. As he turned, Priya saw the side of his face once more, the heavy brow ridge, broad nose, and large lower jaw. But the light was too weak, and he turned away before she could hold more of the image. None of them ever saw his entire face clearly. Close to 4 o'clock, the eastern sky began to lighten. It was not sunrise yet, only a thin blue-gray layer that made the outlines of the mountain ridges visible. The fire still burned low. Derek had just leaned down to adjust a log. Marcus was passing water to Julia. Priya looked toward the northern forest because she had heard a small sound. When she turned back, the Bigfoot was gone. No one saw him leave. There were no heavy footsteps, no branches shaking, and no final roar. The place where he had stood was only an open patch of darkness between the tents and the pines. Derek immediately raised the flashlight and swept it around. The beam caught deep footprints leading west before disappearing among the trees, but it found no body. His absence made the group tense again. They added more wood, sat close together, and continued watching until there was enough light to see farther. The wolves did not return. When the sun rose, the forest around camp looked almost impossibly normal. The pines stood still, the lake reflected pale light, and the ground around the fire was covered with tracks. Derek did not allow anyone to wander. He used his phone and Priya's camera to document the scene before wind or sunlight changed it. Wolf tracks appeared thickly around the outer edge of camp, gathered into clusters and curved lines. Some came within less than 30 feet of the fire ring. Among them were larger prints made by something walking on 2 legs, so deep and long that Marcus placed his own foot beside one simply to show the difference. Around noon, Ranger Tom Whitfield arrived with 2 members of a patrol team. They approached from the south after receiving the satellite alert and re-establishing contact with Derek that morning. Whitfield first checked everyone's health, confirmed no one was injured, then asked each person to describe what had happened separately. Afterward, he began documenting the site according to procedure. In his report, Whitfield described a series of bipedal tracks averaging 18 inches long, broad at the heel, with 5 toe impressions visible in the best preserved prints. The stride was longer than that of an adult human. Some prints were deeper along the outer edge, suggesting the one who made them had turned while following a curve. There was no boot tread, no trekking pole mark, and no unknown human trail leading into the site. The most notable detail was not any individual print, but the way they were distributed. Whitfield wrote that the trackway formed an almost complete arc around the tents and fire ring. In several places, prints overlapped in the same direction, showing the route had been traveled more than once. The perimeter began in the western forest, curved north, crossed in front of the tents, then continued south before returning, close to its starting point. Wolf tracks were concentrated along the outside of that arc. Some showed that wolves had approached, then changed direction, suddenly. Claw marks crossed the soil, and sections of old snow had been torn up where the pack backed away or turned sideways. But Whitfield found no wolf print crossing into the inner side of the bipedal trackway. The line between the 2 sets was clear enough for him to mark separately on the scene diagram. Whitfield did not identify what had made the larger tracks. He measured them, photographed them, recorded direction, depth, and ground conditions. He also collected accounts from all 4 people, without allowing them to hear one another first. Their descriptions matched on the main points: great height, movement on 2 legs, dark hair, a deep roar, the position between camp and the wolves, and the fact that the Bigfoot remained for several hours. Months later, Dr. Lena Ford, a wolf ecologist, was invited to review the report and photographs. She said 12 animals would have been an unusually large number for a single pack in that region at the time, though not impossible. A pack can temporarily grow when younger members have not yet dispersed or when 2 related groups travel together. Ford considered the pack's coordinated retreat from a single threat more notable. Once gray wolves gather in large numbers, they often test, surround, or confront large animals as a group, especially after holding a position for a long time. The fact that the entire pack broke its circle after one roar and a short standoff suggested they judged the risk as extremely high. Ford did not identify the Bigfoot. She only said the physical evidence fit the description of one large individual establishing a boundary, and the wolves did not cross that boundary after withdrawing. The distribution of the prints also did not resemble accidental travel through the area. It looked like repeated patrol around one specific location. Priya kept the clearest photograph taken before the sun and wind softened the edges. In the image, one long footprint lay beside Whitfield's measuring scale, 5 toes clearly visible, in the damp ground. It was the only photograph she shared with a few relatives before storing it in a private folder for years. Whenever Priya looked at it, she did not think first about the roar or the 12 pairs of eyes. She thought about the hours afterward, when a Bigfoot whose face no one saw clearly walked back and forth around 4 strangers until dawn. He did not wait for thanks. He did not let them see the moment he left. He left only a perimeter of footprints. Priya never claimed to understand why he did it. She only knew that on the coldest night of the trip, when the group had no safe option left, a Bigfoot came out of the forest and stood in the place no one else could fill. Years later, the gratitude remained, directed toward the nameless guard who waited until the sky was bright enough before quietly leaving. There is one detail in Derek and Priya's story that I think stays longer than the roar in the night. It is not the moment all 12 wolves stepped backward. It is not the more than 8-foot figure standing in front of camp. It is the following morning, when Ranger Tom Whitfield looked down and realized a bipedal trackway had passed around the tents again and again. A closed arc, a boundary created in silence. If the Bigfoot had appeared by accident, driven the wolves away, and left, the story would end as a display of strength. But the tracks showed he stayed. He did not only force the pack to retreat, he continued patrolling around 4 strangers, keeping them inside while every wolf track remained outside. This is where knowledge of animal behavior becomes useful. But I do not want to use it as a ready-made label placed over everything. In nature, different species often establish order when they meet. One side observes the other's size, posture, sound, and willingness to fight, then decides whether to advance, hold, position, or retreat. Researchers refer to that relationship as an interspecies dominance hierarchy. Gray wolves understand that calculation. They are powerful predators and dangerous when working as a pack, but strength does not make them infinitely reckless. When facing a larger opponent, they still have to weigh the risk of injury, the possible loss of pack members, and the value of what is being contested. That is why wolves giving ground to a grizzly does not necessarily mean they experience fear in the same way humans do. The problem is that there were not 2 or 3 wolves at Titcomb Basin that night. There were 12. That number suggests the pack was not lacking confidence. Human voices, flashlights, and movement around the fire did not drive them away. This was not a group easily scattered by a loud sound. But when the Bigfoot stepped out, the entire calculation changed. He did not need to charge. He only stood between the 2 sides, widened his shoulders, held his body more upright, and released one roar. After several seconds of confrontation, the lead wolf lowered his tail. The others followed him away. What holds my attention is not that the wolves were frightened by a loud noise. It is that they appeared to recognize that the one standing in front of them represented another level of danger. We do not have evidence strong enough to choose one explanation with certainty. But the pack's coordinated response did not resemble a temporary startle reaction. Even so, the most difficult part to explain came after the wolves left. A Bigfoot protecting territory could drive away an opponent and continue on his way. An agitated animal might roar, display his size, then disappear. But the Bigfoot in this story turned his back toward the people, faced the forest, and remained. He repeated the same route enough times for the prints to overlap and form a visible perimeter. Priya did not remember the Bigfoot's face clearly. She saw only a brief outline in weak firelight. But she remembered that he did not sleep. She remembered how the four people finally dared to add wood, drink water, and wait for daylight, because that figure remained outside the firelight. There is a contradiction in that. The Bigfoot who frightened them most was also the reason they began to feel safe. I think that is the center of the story. Not the question of who was stronger, but the moment a Bigfoot powerful enough to overwhelm a pack chose to use that strength to maintain a boundary. He did not wait for their gratitude. When the sky began to brighten, he disappeared without letting anyone see him leave. We can call it territorial instinct, curiosity, or a protective response toward weaker beings under threat. But whatever name we choose, the footprints leave us with the same question. Why did he continue patrolling after the danger had passed? If you have ever watched a wild animal change its behavior the moment a larger species appeared, leave the comment perimeter below and tell me what you saw. And if you had to choose, do you think the Bigfoot that night was protecting his territory, protecting the people, or doing something we do not yet have the language to explain? Remember, sometimes protection does not announce itself with words. It just walks the perimeter all night until the sun says it is safe to leave. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.